Hello, history enthusiasts. Imagine this amid the smoke and fire of World War II as Nazi Germany stood on the brink of collapse. Mysterious rumors spread of colossal machines, lightning-fast rockets, and miracle weapons capable of changing the course of the war overnight. This is not just a story of technology, but a race between reality and legend, between the ambition to touch the future and the darkness of war. In today's video, we'll uncover the secrets of the Wunderwaffe, the weapons once believed to have the power to change the world. History has a way of blurring the line between fact and fantasy, especially when desperation and propaganda collide. In the final frantic years of the Second World War, Nazi Germany was running out of time, resources, and hope. Allied bombers roared, overhead cities lay in ruins, and the once mighty Wehrmacht was being pushed back on every front. Yet amid the chaos, a different kind of battle raged, one fought not with rifles and tanks, but with imagination and fear. Whispers began to circulate of secret laboratories hidden deep in the black forest of colossal machines and physics-defying inventions that might turn the tide overnight. German scientists, so the stories went, were crafting Wunderwaffe wonder weapons so advanced they seemed ripped from the pages of science fiction. 1,000-ton tanks the size of ocean liners, aircraft that could outfly the fastest Allied jets, even weapons that might reach into space and harness the power of the sun itself. To a public battered by relentless air raids and food shortages, these rumors were more than idle gossip. They were a lifeline, a spark of hope that the Reich might still summon a miracle. Nazi propaganda ministers seized on the notion, weaving tales of unstoppable technology to steady a nation on the brink of collapse. Newspapers and radio broadcasts hinted at breakthroughs that would change the course of history. The promise of the Wunderwaffe was as intoxicating as it was implausible, a mixture of cutting-edge research, half-finished prototypes, and outright fantasy. Some of these ideas had kernels of truth. Germany's scientists were indeed among the most innovative of the age. They pioneered jet aircraft, early guided missiles, and sophisticated optics. But as Allied forces would discover after the war, the grandest claims often belonged more to the realm of science fiction than engineering reality. Consider the legend of the 1,000-ton tank, a behemoth so immense that entire bridges would collapse beneath its weight. Engineers sketched designs for it on drafting tables, but the practical problems were staggering. No engine could move it, no road could bear it, and no factory could build it in secret, while Allied reconnaissance planes prowled the skies. Still, the idea captured imaginations on both sides of the conflict. And then there were the truly bizarre whispers of flying discs and anti-gravity devices that defied the known laws of physics, of a sun gun capable of scorching enemy cities from orbit, of an underground reactor that might yield a Nazi atomic bomb. Each story grew in the telling, passed from soldier to soldier, amplified by fear and fascination. Even Allied intelligence officers occasionally entertained these tales, wondering if behind the smoke there might be some dangerous fire. But the greatest power of the Wunderwaffe was psychological. When your enemy believes you might possess a weapon they cannot imagine, doubt seeps into every strategy session. Was the next bombing raid going to be met with a beam of pure energy from the heavens? Would a secret jet squadron suddenly appear to shatter Allied air superiority? Hitler's regime understood this game well. By nurturing mystery, they bought time and sowed uncertainty. That tension between reality and myth makes the story of Nazi wonder weapons so compelling today. Because while many of these projects were indeed flights of fancy, others were all too real. They represented the last desperate gamble of a regime cornered and gasping for survival. A regime willing to pursue any invention, no matter how dangerous or improbable, if it meant delaying defeat for even a few months. As we journey deeper into this strange world, we'll peel back the layers of rumor and propaganda to examine what Germany actually built and what it merely dreamed. We'll see how stories of miracle machines, from colossal tanks to space-based death rays, emerged from a toxic mix of genuine scientific brilliance, political desperation, and the human hunger for marvels when the darkness of war seems absolute. This is not just a tale of exotic blueprints and lost prototypes. It's also a cautionary saga about the seductive power of technology and myth. Because in the waning days of the Third Reich, the promise of the Wunderwaffe wasn't just about engineering. It was about hope, fear, and the lengths to which people will go when reality offers no salvation. From the secret underground tunnels of Mittelwerk to the conference rooms of Berlin where propaganda was forged, we will explore these so-called wonder weapons, some that flew, some that failed, and some that never existed outside fevered imaginations. Prepare to step into a realm where the boundaries between science and superstition blur, where desperation fuels innovation, and where the echoes of impossible machines still capture our curiosity 8 decades later. Among the most tantalizing legends of the Nazi Wunderwaffe, none shines or perhaps glows quite as strangely as Die Glock the Bell. Shrouded in secrecy and whispered about for decades, this object has become a centerpiece of alternative history, the kind of story that draws both science buffs and UFO enthusiasts into endless debates. The tale begins not in wartime archives, but in the year 2000 when Polish author Igor Witkowski published The Truth About the Wunderwaffe. In it, he described a mysterious Nazi experiment supposedly carried out in a hidden facility near the Czech border. The core of the claim, a bell-shaped device made of hard metal about 9 feet high and 4 feet wide, encased in thick ceramic and filled with a glowing purple liquid. According to Witkowski, the machine could manipulate gravity itself, enabling anti-gravity flight or even time travel. The description reads like the blueprint of a science fiction serial one that could have thrilled audiences of the 1930s as much as it fascinates conspiracy theorists today. Supporters of the story argue that the Nazis, desperate to win the war, might have been open to any experiment that promised a technological edge, no matter how outlandish. The alleged code name for the project was Kronos, a nod to time itself, which only deepened the mystery. But when historians hunt for evidence, the trail turns cold almost immediately. No reliable wartime documents mention such a project. No surviving scientist ever admitted to working on an anti-gravity engine. The only physical remnants ever linked to the bell are the so-called henge structures, massive concrete rings, in the forests of Lower Silesia, which some enthusiasts claim were testing rigs. Yet careful studies reveal them to be mundane industrial footings, likely for a cooling tower or water tank. So why does the myth endure? Part of the answer lies in the psychological landscape of post-war Europe. The Nazis had already demonstrated a willingness to push scientific boundaries in terrifying directions. Think of the V-2 rockets raining down on London or the deadly experiments carried out in concentration camps. If a regime was ruthless enough to weaponize human suffering, who's to say it wouldn't also attempt to rewrite the laws of physics? Moreover, the early Cold War provided fertile soil for stories of secret superweapons. When the United States and Soviet Union both quietly recruited former Nazi scientists under programs like Operation Paperclip, it wasn't hard for the public to imagine that truly exotic technologies might also have been spirited away. Flying saucer sightings exploded in the late 1940s, and in popular imagination, the dots began to connect. Perhaps UFOs were not alien at all, but remnants of Hitler's hidden research now tested in the deserts of New Mexico or the icy wastes of Siberia. Even respected scientists added accidental fuel to the fire. As physics advanced through the 1950s and 60s with breakthroughs in quantum mechanics and the nascent field of anti-gravity research, the once ridiculous idea of manipulating gravity didn't seem entirely impossible to the layperson. Science fiction magazines ran wild with the concept, and Die Glock quietly morphed from a forgotten footnote into a full-blown cultural meme. Today, documentaries and late-night radio shows keep the story alive, often presenting the bell as history's greatest hidden invention, but professional historians remain unconvinced. They point to the absence of credible documents, the lack of physical artifacts, and the implausibility of the physics described. Most compellingly, Germany in the final years of the war was suffering crippling shortages of manpower, food, and basic materials. Aluminum and copper were rationed to the point where even proven aircraft designs were delayed. Could a resource-starved Reich have poured effort into a fantastical gravity machine with no guarantee of success? It stretches belief. Still, the Bell legend holds power because it embodies the tension between what we know and what we yearn to discover. In a world where genuine Nazi innovations like jet fighters and guided missiles leapt years ahead of the Allies, the leap from advanced rocketry to anti-gravity doesn't feel impossibly wide to the popular imagination. And so Die Glocke endures not as fact, but as a parable of human curiosity and fear. Some researchers have tried to tie the bell to real scientific experiments of the era. For example, Germany did investigate centrifuges for uranium enrichment and high-voltage particle research, both of which involved spinning mechanisms that might inspire descriptions of a humming bell-shaped device. Others point to Nazi interest in Vril energy, a mythical force borrowed from occult literature as cultural background for the tale. While these links are circumstantial, they reveal how genuine science, pseudoscience, and mysticism blended within parts of the Nazi hierarchy. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, notoriously patronized occult ideas, sponsoring expeditions to Tibet and encouraging studies of ancient Germanic mysticism. It is not hard to imagine that whispers of secret energy weapons, whether credible or not, could have circulated among such circles. If the Bell story has any kernel of truth, it might rest here in an atmosphere where esoteric dreams and technical ambition mingled freely, where engineers and mystics sometimes drank from the same well of speculation. But even if the Bell never existed as a working machine, its legend teaches us something profound about war and belief. In times of existential crisis, people cling to marvels. They spin tales of salvation through impossible inventions. These myths can comfort, terrify, or inspire, but they reveal as much about the human heart as about scientific possibility. As we leave the glowing shadow of Die Glocke, we step from outright myth toward the next great Nazi fantasy, a weapon not of gravity, but of sunlight. If the Bell promised power over space and time, the next project dared to harness the most ancient and formidable force of all, the sun itself. If Die Glocke was a story of hidden chambers and occult whispers, the so-called sun gun was something far more public and paradoxically even more fantastical. Where the Bell promised dominion over gravity, the sun gun aimed to turn the very star at the center of our solar system into a Nazi superweapon. The seed of this idea can be traced to 1929, long before Hitler's rise to power, when visionary physicist Hermann Oberth, one of the pioneers of modern rocketry, proposed an orbital space station equipped with a colossal concave mirror. His concept was on paper an ambitious exploration of space technology, a platform hundreds of miles above the Earth, fitted with a reflective surface 9 square kilometers wide. By focusing sunlight into an intense beam, the station could, in theory, direct devastating heat onto any target on Earth. It was an audacious idea, part science and part spectacle. Oberth himself saw it more as a future energy source than a death ray. But in the fevered climate of Nazi Germany, even the most speculative scientific proposals could be reimagined as tools of domination. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, a team of German army scientists at the Hillersleben Artillery Proving Grounds allegedly revisited Oberth's concept, this time envisioning the mirror as a weapon to scorch enemy cities or boil enemy fleets in the ocean. Imagine the drama of it, a silent, gleaming station in low Earth orbit, tilting its massive mirror toward London or Washington and focusing the relentless light of the sun into a pinpoint of ruin. In the darkest years of the war, such an idea must have felt like a celestial ace up the sleeve, an ultimate triumph of German engineering over Allied might. Yet from the very first engineering calculations, the Sonnengeschütz, as some documents called it, was doomed by physics. The challenge lay not in merely placing a mirror in space, already a Herculean feat for the 1940s, but in the laws of optics. At the altitude envisioned, any reflected sunlight would spread into a patch roughly 64 kilometers across by the time it reached Earth. That's no surgical death ray. At best, it might create a slightly uncomfortable warm spot in a meadow or make Allied pilots squint skyward. Far from igniting a city, it wouldn't even light a match. Still, the sun gun captured the imagination of Nazi planners and later the public. Wartime newspapers whispered about space mirrors and cosmic weapons. After the war, Allied investigators uncovered sketches and technical notes which only added fuel to the fire of rumor. In 1945, Life magazine published an illustrated feature about the idea, sparking a wave of both fascination and ridicule across the United States. The article described a mirror of metallic sodium built in orbit over decades, capable of burning an enemy city to ashes. To a world still reeling from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the possibility of a Nazi space superweapon, however remote, resonated as both thrilling and terrifying. The cultural impact of the sun gun outlived the Third Reich. It inspired comic books and pulp novels through the 1950s and 1960s, when the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union reawakened dreams and fears of orbital super projects. The very idea that humans might someday weaponize space drew serious attention from military planners and science fiction writers alike. Even today, when we deploy satellites armed only with sensors and cameras, echoes of Oberth's vision linger in the way we talk about solar power satellites or concentrated solar beams. Looking back, the sun gun reveals more about the mindset of Nazi Germany than about real military potential. It embodies the grandiosity that took hold as the war turned against the Reich. If victory could no longer be achieved on the battlefield, perhaps it might be snatched from the heavens. In a regime steeped in spectacle and myth, the image of a space-borne weapon fit perfectly with the narrative of an unstoppable Aryan science. The project also underscores a recurring theme of the Wunderwaffe story, the thin line between credible research and propaganda theater. Rocket pioneers like Oberth and Wernher von Braun were genuine visionaries whose work laid the foundation for human spaceflight. But their ideas could be, and often were, reframed as tools of terror by those eager to project power. When Nazi officials spoke of weapons that could reach across the globe, they weren't just daydreaming. They were engaging in psychological warfare, hoping to rattle the Allies with the specter of a technological leap too great to counter. From a modern perspective, it's tempting to laugh at the sun gun as a quaint absurdity. Yet it serves as a warning. History shows that yesterday's impossibilities sometimes become today's realities. In the 1920s, the idea of a man-made object orbiting Earth was the stuff of fantasy. By 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. By 1969, humans stood on the moon. While a giant orbital mirror remains wildly impractical, other once ridiculous concepts like lasers from space or kinetic bombardment rods are now active subjects of military research. For the Nazi scientists of the 1940s, though, the sun gun remained a dream on the drawing board, a testament to ambition unbound by the constraints of wartime scarcity. Germany was already struggling to produce enough steel and fuel to keep its tanks moving and its planes in the air. To divert resources to a multi-decade orbital project would have been lunacy. The fact that the idea was ever seriously considered even briefly shows the degree of desperation and delusion that gripped parts of the regime. As Allied armies closed in this and other grandiose schemes became less a blueprint and more a mirage, a final flourish in the theater of Nazi propaganda. Yet the story of the sun gun reminds us that human imagination is both a spark for progress and a tool for fear. It stands as a shining, if utterly impractical example of how far a nation might reach when the Earth itself seems too small for its ambitions. But if the sun gun was a fantasy of cosmic proportions, Germany's next ventures brought the strange and the real into unsettling proximity. These were not grand orbital mirrors or anti-gravity engines, but mechanical beasts of iron and steel machines meant to thunder across the battlefield. From the realm of the stars, our journey now descends back to Earth, to inventions that could actually be built, driven, and deployed. Among them lurked a contraption as odd as any space mirror, a rolling sphere of armor known as the Kugelpanzer. From a speculative weapon in orbit, we now plunge back to the mud and smoke of the battlefield, to a machine as tangible as cold steel, yet as mysterious as any legend, the Kugelpanzer or ball tank. If the sun gun was a dream in the clouds, the Kugelpanzer was a riddle on the ground, an armored enigma that still defies easy explanation. The story begins in the chaotic twilight of the Third Reich. In 1945, as the Red Army swept through Manchuria, Soviet forces discovered a strange, almost otherworldly vehicle abandoned on the grounds of a Japanese military facility in Harbin, China. Unlike anything seen before, it was a perfectly rounded sphere of steel, barely taller than a man, with a small viewing slit, a hatch, and two wide rollers that allowed it to move forward and back. No official German documents mentioned it. No blueprints surfaced. No field reports recorded it in action. Yet there it was, an artifact of war that seemed to belong in a pulp comic or a surrealist painting more than in an actual army. The Soviets, puzzled and intrigued, shipped the lone Kugelpanzer back to Moscow for study. It sits today in the Kubinka Tank Museum, dented and silent, an exhibit that raises more questions than it answers. Its specifications are modest: a thin steel shell about 1.5 meters in diameter, lightly armored, only 5 millimeters thick, and weighing roughly 1.8 tons. A small two-stroke engine powered a single operator seated inside. But beyond those facts, almost everything else is speculation. Was it a reconnaissance vehicle designed to sneak through enemy lines and relay information? Perhaps a cable-laying machine rolling steadily as it unspooled telephone wires across contested terrain. Some theorists imagine it as a forward observer's craft, its small size allowing it to inch close to enemy positions under cover of night. Others suggest it was an experiment in shock tactics, a tiny armored probe meant to scatter infantry through sheer surprise. Each theory reveals more about our own imagination than about the machine itself. Why create a vehicle shaped like a perfect sphere? A ball can roll in any direction, needing no complex steering. In theory, such a design could traverse trenches or rubble more smoothly than a wheeled vehicle. Yet the Kugelpanzer's paper-thin armor offered almost no protection against bullets, and its cramped interior meant the operator would endure a noisy, sweltering ride with minimal visibility. As a weapon of war, it bordered on absurdity. But wartime Germany was fertile ground for such oddities. By the early 1940s, German engineers were exploring countless unconventional prototypes, driven by both Hitler's fascination with technological marvels and the regime's growing desperation. Projects often began with flashes of ingenuity, sometimes brilliant, sometimes bizarre, and proceeded to the prototype stage before reality intervened. Resources were scarce, priorities shifted, and many concepts languished after a single test model. The Kugelpanzer fits this pattern perfectly, imaginative, perhaps promising in theory, but ultimately impractical. What makes the Kugelpanzer particularly captivating is how it embodies the collision of science fiction and military necessity. Picture an isolated workshop where engineers debate how to create a reconnaissance vehicle that can slip through enemy lines. A designer sketches a sphere, calculating its stability and ability to pivot instantly. The project receives a small grant, just enough to build one prototype. Months later, as Allied forces close in, the half-forgotten machine is packed off to an ally in Asia, a curiosity rather than a weapon its mission never tested in combat. When Soviet soldiers found it, they must have paused in disbelief. After years of brutal warfare marked by Tiger tanks and Katyusha rockets, here was a war machine that looked more like a carnival ride than an instrument of death. The Kugelpanzer seemed to mock the seriousness of the conflict, a reminder that even amid catastrophe, human invention can veer into the surreal. The sphere's journey to Manchuria adds another layer of intrigue. How did a German prototype end up in Japanese hands? In the final years of the war, Germany and Japan exchanged technical knowledge despite the vast distance separating them. U-boats carried blueprints, and specialized aircraft attempted long-range transfers of technology. Perhaps the Kugelpanzer was part of such an exchange, a token of cooperation, or a desperate bid to share experimental designs that might still influence the war in Asia. We may never know whether it was shipped for testing, gifted as a curiosity, or traded for other innovations. Inside the museum today, the Kugelpanzer attracts a steady stream of visitors who marvel at its oddity. Children pressed their faces to the glass, imagining what it would feel like to rattle inside a rolling steel sphere. Historians peer at its rivets and welds, searching for clues to its purpose. Yet no definitive story emerges. The machine remains mute, its secrets locked within its cold shell. In many ways, the Kugelpanzer is emblematic of the entire Wunderwaffe phenomenon. It straddles the line between credibility and absurdity, a tangible artifact that still invites outlandish theories. Unlike the mythical bell or the impractical sun gun, it exists. We can touch it, measure it, photograph it. And yet, it might as well be a relic from another world for all we truly understand it. This small spherical tank also highlights a broader truth about wartime innovation, that desperation breeds experimentation, but not always success. Under pressure, engineers are encouraged to think wildly to test boundaries. Most of these experiments fail quietly, but a few, like jet propulsion or rocket technology, reshape the future. The Kugelpanzer sits on the opposite end of that spectrum, a reminder that not every daring concept leads to greatness. From this peculiar steel orb, our story turns to an even larger symbol of Nazi ambition, a machine conceived not for stealth, but for sheer crushing dominance. If the Kugelpanzer was a whisper, the next project was a roar, a super heavy tank so massive that it defied logic and infrastructure alike. Where the ball tank teased the imagination with mystery, the Landkreuzer P.1000 rat sought to overwhelm reality itself with brute force. If the Kugelpanzer was a riddle in steel, the next concept was a thunderclap of pure excess. The Landkreuzer P.1000 Rete, a proposed land cruiser so enormous that even today its blueprints seem like an engineer's fever dream. Where the ball tank aimed for stealth, the rat embodied sheer terrifying spectacle. The idea took root in 1942, a moment when Nazi Germany was reeling from mounting defeats, yet still intoxicated by visions of unstoppable might. It was Adolf Hitler himself who approved the preliminary plans for a tank that would dwarf every armored vehicle before or since. Bigger is better was more than a slogan to the Führer. It was an obsession. The rat would be the ultimate expression of that belief, a machine intended to dominate the battlefield by size alone. A rolling battleship. Imagine a tank longer than a tennis court, wider than a two-lane highway, and heavier than some destroyer-class naval vessels. The Ratty was designed to weigh an almost inconceivable 1,000 metric tons, nearly 10 times the mass of the already formidable Tiger II heavy tank. Its hull would stretch more than 35 meters over 115 feet, with armor plating up to 360 millimeters thick in places. The primary armament. Not a conventional tank gun, but two 280mm naval cannons, the kind mounted on capital ships capable of hurling massive shells over 40 kilometers. Secondary weapons included multiple 128mm anti-tank guns, a battery of smaller artillery, and a forest of machine guns for close defense. The Rat would effectively be a battleship on tracks, a land dreadnought whose very presence could, at least in theory, shatter enemy morale. To move this behemoth, engineers envisioned a pair of massive manned diesel marine engines delivering a combined 17,000 horsepower. Even so, the top speed was estimated at a plodding 40 kilometers per hour on ideal terrain. But ideal terrain scarcely existed. At 1,000 tons, the Rat would have crushed most bridges under its own weight, rendering river crossings nearly impossible. Its sheer bulk meant it could only operate in open plains, and even there, its colossal tracks would have torn up roads and farmland like an earthquake. The problem of scale. Logistics quickly revealed the project's fatal flaws. Transporting the Rat from factory to front line would have been a nightmare. Railroads could not accommodate its width. Special assembly yards would have been required near the battlefield itself. Supplying fuel for such a leviathan, likely thousands of liters per 100 kilometers, would have been a Herculean task for a Reich already starved of oil. Then there was the issue of vulnerability. Though heavily armored, the Rata's sheer size would have made it an easy target for Allied bombers. A single well-placed airstrike or artillery barrage could disable the tracks or engines, immobilizing the giant and turning it into an expensive steel coffin. Engineers at Krupp, tasked with the design, recognized these issues almost immediately. Some quietly questioned whether the project was more a political fantasy than a serious military solution. Nevertheless, preliminary drawings were drafted and proposals circulated. For a time, Hitler's enthusiasm kept the dream alive. A symbol of desperation, the Ratte epitomized the Nazi regime's late-war psychology. When outmatched in manpower and resources, they sought salvation in technological marvels. The project was propaganda as much as engineering. Imagine the headlines had it been built: a 1,000-ton juggernaut rumbling across the Eastern Front, a visual proof of Germany's supposed invincibility. The spectacle alone might have been considered worth the effort by a leader increasingly detached from reality. But not everyone was swept up by the fantasy. Albert Speer, the pragmatic minister of armaments and war production, reportedly viewed the Ratte as a costly distraction. By 1943, as Allied bombing intensified and resources dwindled, he persuaded Hitler to shelve the project. Only a few design studies and some scale models survived the war. Echoes in military history. Though the Ratte never left the drawing board, its ghost haunts the annals of armored warfare. The idea of a land battleship was not uniquely German. During World War I, British engineers flirted with the concept of giant multi-turreted tanks. In the 1930s, the Soviet Union built the T-35, a lumbering multi-turreted vehicle that proved slow and vulnerable. The French experimented with the massive Char 2C, and even the United States briefly considered super-heavy prototypes, yet none approached the audacity or absurdity of the P.1000. For modern readers, the Rat serves as a cautionary tale of technological hubris. Bigger is not always better. In fact, it is often worse. The resources that would have gone into a single Ratte could have produced hundreds of conventional tanks, aircraft, or submarines, assets far more useful in actual combat. In a sense, the Ratte's impracticality underscores the disconnect between Hitler's grandiose dreams and the grim logistical realities of war. Legacy and imagination. Today, the Rat lives on in video games, alternate history novels, and model kits, where its colossal size makes it an irresistible subject for enthusiasts of what-if military history. Artists depict it rolling across vast steppes, turrets blazing a monster of iron and fire. Gamers pitted against squadrons of Allied bombers, or imagine it dueling Cold War tanks. These fictional encounters highlight the enduring allure of machines that test the limits of possibility. But beyond pop culture, the Ratte's story reveals something profound about the human urge to build the unimaginable. In times of existential threat, grand projects can become symbols of hope or defiance. They promise a shortcut to victory, a single magnificent creation that will overturn the tide. Yet history shows that such dreams often drain more than they deliver. From blueprint to mouse, the cancellation of the Rate did not end Germany's fascination with super-heavy armor. The core concept, an armored vehicle of unprecedented scale and firepower, was pared down and reimagined as the Panzer E8 Maus, a tank that, while smaller, remained gargantuan by any normal measure. At only 180 tons, the Maus was actually built and tested, becoming the heaviest operational tank ever constructed. This shift from the 1,000-ton fantasy of the Ratte to the still massive but somewhat practical Maus illustrates the narrowing path of Nazi weapons development as the war dragged on. Dreams of impossible giants gave way to prototypes that, while still over-engineered, at least had a chance of rolling onto a battlefield. A monster never born. Had the Ratte somehow been completed, what role could it have played? Perhaps it would have served as a mobile fortress, lobbing naval shells at distant targets while shrugging off smaller enemy fire. Maybe its psychological impact alone would have made Allied soldiers pause. But most historians agree it would likely have been a slow, vulnerable target destroyed by airstrikes long before it fired a shot in anger. And yet one can almost hear the deep metallic rumble that might have echoed across the fields of Eastern Europe, the earth trembling under 1,000 tons of steel. That sound exists only in imagination, but it is powerful nonetheless, a reminder of how war drives men to envision machines as terrifying as any creature of myth. As we leave behind the unbuilt titan of the Ratte, our journey continues toward the vehicle that inherited its oversized ambitions, and actually made it off the drawing board. If the Ratte was the impossible dream, the Panzer E8 Maus became the improbable reality, a super heavy tank that rolled, fired, and confounded even its creators. Where the Landkreuz Ratte remained a wild fantasy, the Panzer VIII Maus lumbered into reality, proof that Nazi Germany's obsession with colossal armor did not end with paper blueprints. Conceived as a more practical alternative to the 1,000-ton Ratte, the Maus still defied common sense. At roughly 180 metric tons, it was and remains the heaviest fully enclosed tank ever built. Conception of a giant. The Maus project began in 1942 when Hitler demanded an indestructible breakthrough tank capable of overwhelming any Allied armor. Ferdinand Porsche, already renowned for his engineering genius and his complicated ties to the Nazi regime, was tasked with the design. Porsche envisioned a vehicle that would dominate the battlefield through sheer mass and firepower. The result was a monster nearly 10 meters long, over 3.5 meters wide, and 3.6 meters high, taller than many houses of the era. Its armor ranged from 150 mm on the sides to an astonishing 240 mm on the front, thicker than the frontal armor of most naval cruisers. This made the Maus virtually immune to the anti-tank weapons of the early 1940s. To pierce it, Allied gunners would have needed direct hits from heavy artillery or specialized explosives, no small feat against a moving target of that size. Armament without compromise. The Maus carried a 128 mm KWK-44 L55 main gun, a weapon designed to annihilate enemy tanks at distances exceeding 2 kilometers. A coaxial 75 mm gun allowed it to engage lighter armored vehicles or fortifications without wasting massive shells. The firepower dwarfed that of the feared Tiger II, and even rivaled the naval guns mounted on some smaller warships. The turret alone weighed as much as an entire medium tank, and rotating it required an elaborate hydraulic system. Every aspect of the design screamed overkill, from the oversized breech mechanisms to the massive counterweights needed to balance the gun. Engineering nightmares. Yet with size came endless problems. The Maus's enormous bulk demanded a power plant far beyond what German industry could reliably supply. Engineers experimented with a 1,200 horsepower Daimler-Benz MB 517 diesel engine, but even this left the tank crawling at a top speed of only 13 km per h on paved roads and far less off-road. Fuel consumption was staggering, dozens of liters per kilometer at a time, when Germany was already desperate for oil. Transportation posed another near-impossible challenge. No bridge could support its weight, so the Maus had to ford rivers using snorkel systems or depend on specially built pontoon bridges. Rail transport was impractical. Moving the tank from factory to front required disassembling parts of its chassis or finding custom flat cars that barely existed. In effect, the Maus could fight only in areas where it was built or delivered by barge, sharply limiting any tactical flexibility. Field trials and limited production. Despite these obstacles, Porsche and Krupp pushed ahead. By late 1944, 2 prototypes were completed: V1, a hull without a turret for mobility trials, and V2, a fully armed model. Testing took place at the Kummersdorf and Boblingen proving grounds. Engineers marveled at its protection during trials. Even the most powerful Allied anti-tank weapons could barely scratch its frontal armor. But the trials also confirmed its fatal weaknesses. The Maus's tremendous weight tore up roads and strained bridges. Its sluggish speed made it easy prey for Allied bombers, whose dominance of the skies rendered such a slow-moving fortress dangerously vulnerable. Every kilometer it traveled required meticulous planning, and its engine reliability was always in question. By the time the first Maus prototypes rumbled across the test fields, the war situation had changed dramatically. Germany was on the defensive everywhere. Factories were being bombed nightly, and resources were desperately needed for weapons that could be produced quickly and in numbers. Albert Speer, always the realist, recognized that the Maus was an extravagance Germany could no longer afford. The plan for mass production, originally a run of 150 vehicles, was quietly canceled. Only the 2 prototypes were ever completed. The Last Stand. As the Red Army closed in during 1945, German engineers tried to prevent the Maus from falling intact into enemy hands. V-1 was destroyed by its crew. V-2 was scuttled near the Kummersdorf test range. The Soviets, however, captured the remains of both prototypes and eventually combined parts to create a single, complete Maus for evaluation. That reconstructed vehicle survives today in the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow, an awe-inspiring relic of ambition unmoored from reality. Psychological and symbolic power. Although it never fired a shot in combat, the Maus had a psychological weight far greater than its steel plating. For the Nazi regime, it represented the idea that German engineering genius could still deliver a miracle weapon to turn the tide. For Allied intelligence, early reports of a massive new tank spurred both anxiety and incredulity, proof of how rumors of superweapons could influence morale on both sides. The Maus also serves as a cautionary lesson in military design. Bigger is not necessarily better. Every advantage, thicker armor, heavier firepower, brought disproportionate costs in mobility, logistics, and production. For the resources consumed by a single Maus, Germany could have built dozens of proven Panzer IVs or Tiger-S vehicles that might actually have affected the war's outcome. Legacy of the Behemoth. Today, the Maus captures the imagination of historians, model builders, and gamers alike. It appears in alternate history novels, strategy games, and military museums as an icon of what-if warfare. Standing before the surviving Maus and Kubinka, visitors are struck not only by its size, but by the eerie silence. It embodies a monument to ambition that never found a battlefield. The Maus was the high-water mark of Germany's super-heavy tank program, but it was not the end of the Wunderwaffe story. As 1942 turned into 1943, Albert Speer and the Nazi high command began looking beyond armored giants to a different kind of miracle, one that leapt from the ground to the stratosphere. The focus shifted toward weapons that could reach Britain without ever crossing the English Channel, rockets that would scream across the sky faster than any plane sowing terror in cities hundreds of kilometers away. These projects soon to become infamous, as the V-weapons would combine genuine technical brilliance with ruthless exploitation of human labor. They promised not just psychological shock, but real strategic impact, carrying the Reich's war deep into Allied territory. From the lumbering might of the Maus, our journey now ascends into the realm of fire and flight, where the dream of a swift, decisive wonder weapon seemed for a time almost within Germany's grasp. As Germany's early war momentum faltered and the Eastern Front bled resources at an unsustainable pace, the Nazi leadership turned its hopes to technology. By 1942, the dream of a lightning-fast victory had evaporated. The Allies were tightening their grip, production was strained, and the Luftwaffe no longer ruled the skies. It was in this crucible of desperation that the myth and machinery of the Wunderwaffe, literally wonder weapons, began to crystallize into a formal program. A vision fueled by propaganda and fear, Hitler's fascination with miracle weapons was not new. Since the 1930s, he had been captivated by tales of secret superweapons that could ensure German dominance. But as defeats mounted Stalingrad in the east, the relentless bombing of German cities in the west, his obsession deepened. The notion that a single spectacular technological breakthrough might reverse Germany's fortunes became both a propaganda tool and a personal fixation. Enter Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production. Speer was an able administrator with a keen eye for efficiency, but he also understood the psychological power of the Wunderwaffe narrative. To a weary and fearful German public, the idea of revolutionary weapons arriving to smash the enemy and secure victory was intoxicating. Speer recognized that nurturing this belief could sustain morale and buy time, even if the weapons themselves remained distant dreams. In mid-1942, Speer formalized what had been a patchwork of advanced projects into a coordinated effort. This Wunderwaffe program wasn't a single laboratory or factory. It was a sprawling constellation of initiatives scattered across Germany and occupied Europe, from underground rocket facilities to secret research stations hidden in mountain valleys. Engineers, physicists, and inventors were urged to push beyond the limits of known science. Resources, despite the Reich's acute shortages, were diverted to projects that promised dramatic breakthroughs. Promise and desperation. The program's goals range from plausible innovations to outright fantasy. Some efforts built on Germany's proven engineering strengths advanced rocketry, jet propulsion, and heavy armor. Others delved into the speculative and bizarre particle beams, anti-gravity experiments, and weapons powered by cosmic energy. In many ways, the Wunderwaffe program became a mirror of Nazi Germany itself, an unstable blend of technical brilliance, mystical thinking, and political theater. Speer played a delicate game. Publicly, he promoted these projects as evidence of the regime's boundless ingenuity. Privately, he knew many were impractical. Yet he also understood that even failures could serve the larger purpose of sustaining belief. In a regime where dissent could mean death, scientists and engineers often exaggerated progress, feeding Hitler's appetite for miracle weapons and securing continued funding for their laboratories. The propaganda ministry amplified every rumor. Newspapers trumpeted secret weapons that would soon sweep the Allies from the skies. Radio broadcasts hinted at unseen machines poised to unleash devastation. Each whisper kept alive the fantasy that Germany possessed or soon would possess technology so advanced that mere numbers could not defeat it. For the German people battered by Allied bombings and mounting casualties, these stories offered a flicker of hope. For the Allies, they sowed unease. Intelligence agencies scrambled to separate fact from fiction, worrying that behind the rumors might lurk a real threat, an unstoppable jet fighter, a long-range missile, or worse. Underground laboratories and hidden factories. The Wunderwaffe program's physical footprint was as secretive as its ambitions. Deep beneath the Harz Mountains in a vast subterranean complex called Mittelwerk, thousands of slave laborers toiled to assemble the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. Conditions were horrific. Prisoners from concentration camps worked 12 to 14-hour shifts in darkness and filth, with beatings and executions a constant terror. Thousands died of disease, malnutrition, and abuse. The rocket that would awe the world was born in a hellscape of forced labor. Elsewhere, secret wind tunnels tested jet aircraft that could outfly anything in the Allied arsenal. Hidden labs experimented with radar-guided bombs, infrared night vision devices, and chemical fuels for rocket engines. Engineers pursued projects so advanced they seemed like science fiction ramjet-powered aircraft capable of near supersonic speeds, vertical takeoff, and landing prototypes and missiles that could cross the Atlantic. Even projects that never moved beyond the prototype stage contributed to a growing mystique. Whispers of death rays and space mirrors merged with reports of actual breakthroughs, creating a fog of uncertainty that served Nazi propaganda well. Allied intelligence sometimes overestimated the Germans' capabilities, diverting resources to counter threats that existed only on drawing boards. Technology amid collapse. By late 1943, however, the contradiction at the heart of the Wunderwaffe program became stark. While Hitler demanded ever more ambitious weapons, Germany's industrial base was crumbling. Allied bombing campaigns destroyed factories and railways. Skilled laborers were conscripted for the front or lost to the death camps. Precious raw materials grew scarce. Projects competed fiercely for dwindling supplies of steel, aluminum, and fuel. Yet Hitler's faith in miracle weapons only grew. In meetings with his generals, he spoke of rockets that would level London jet fighters that would sweep Allied bombers from the sky, and submarines that would starve Britain into submission. These were not merely military calculations, they were acts of faith. The Wunderwaffe had become an article of belief, a technological messiah that would redeem the Reich. Some of these projects remarkably approached viability. The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket would soon rain destruction on Allied cities, demonstrating a technological sophistication that startled even seasoned military analysts. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, was capable of speeds no Allied aircraft could match. Night vision scopes and assault rifles pointed toward the future of infantry combat. But other projects remained mired in fantasy or practical impossibility. Super heavy tanks consumed vast resources for little strategic gain. Exotic energy weapons and orbital mirrors existed mainly as sketches and rumors. The gap between Hitler's dreams and Germany's capabilities widened with every passing month. A psychological weapon. For the German populace, the Wunderwaffe narrative was both a comfort and a trap. It promised that science and genius might yet save the fatherland. It masked the grim reality of defeat with a shimmering vision of imminent triumph. And for a time it worked. Civilians who listened to Goebbels' broadcasts could imagine secret laboratories turning out weapons beyond Allied comprehension. Soldiers at the front could cling to the hope that reinforcements of a new kind, a jet squadron, a rocket barrage, a miracle tank might arrive to reverse their fortunes. Allied leaders, too, took the threat seriously. Reports of mysterious German experiments fueled anxiety in London and Washington. Intelligence briefings speculated about long-range rockets carrying chemical or even nuclear payloads. Strategic bombing campaigns increasingly targeted research sites, not just factories and airfields. In a sense, the Wunderwaffe succeeded as psychological warfare, even when the weapons themselves failed to materialize. The stage is set. By mid-1942 and into 1943, the stage was set for the next phase of the story, the dramatic unveiling of the V-weapons, the technological terror that would bring the war's first glimpse of a ballistic missile and change the face of modern warfare. These were no longer just laboratory curiosities or propaganda fantasies. They were real lethal machines that would soon arc across the night sky toward London and Antwerp, their fiery trails announcing that the age of the rocket had arrived. From the massive steel of the Maus to the hidden tunnels of Mittelwerk, the Nazi pursuit of Wunderwaffe reveals a paradox: immense technical brilliance shackled to delusion. The program was at once a marvel of engineering and a monument to desperation, proof that even the most advanced technology cannot rescue a regime collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions and crimes. And so, as 1943 waned and Allied bombers darkened German skies, the first of these so-called miracle weapons prepared for launch, a shrieking prelude to the space age and a harbinger of terror for the cities below. By the summer of 1944, Hitler's long-promised Vergeltungswaffen, weapons of retaliation, finally emerged from blueprint and rumor to reality. Among them, the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket were the crown jewels of the Wunderwaffe program, tangible proof that Germany's scientists could reach across the English Channel and strike at the heart of Britain without a single pilot in the cockpit. The V-1, the buzz bomb. The V-1, or Fiesler Phi 103, was the simpler of the two, but no less terrifying to those beneath its path. This pilotless jet-powered missile looked like a small airplane with stubby wings and a pulsing Argus motor mounted on its back. Launched from ramps in occupied Europe, it traveled at over 600 kilometers per hour and carried an 850-kilogram warhead, enough to level city blocks. Its most chilling feature was its sound, a harsh staccato drone that earned it the nickname Buzz Bomb or Doodlebug. Londoners learned to dread the moment the buzzing stopped, for that meant the engine had cut out and the missile was plunging toward its target. Beginning in June 1944, only a week after the D-Day invasion, V-1S streaked across the English Channel almost nightly. The Allies scrambled to counter the threat. Anti-aircraft guns and barrage balloons claimed many of the missiles, and daring fighter pilots even devised the risky tactic of tipping a V-1's wing mid-flight to destabilize its gyroscope. Still, hundreds reached their targets, killing more than 6,000 civilians in London alone and injuring tens of thousands. Although relatively crude, its guidance system was little more than a mechanical autopilot. The V-1 foreshadowed the age of the cruise missile. It proved that unmanned weapons could be built cheaply and in large numbers to terrorize civilian populations. The V-2, the first ballistic missile. If the V-1 was frightening, the V-2 was revolutionary. Officially, the Aggregate 4 was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, a true ancestor of today's intercontinental rockets. Standing over 14 meters tall, powered by a liquid fuel engine burning ethanol and liquid oxygen, the V-2 could reach supersonic speeds and strike targets up to 320 kilometers away. Unlike the V-1, the V-2 arrived without warning. It ascended into the stratosphere, arced silently across the sky, and plunged faster than the speed of sound. There was no defense. By the time anyone heard the double crack of its sonic boom and detonation, the destruction had already occurred. The first operational V-2 attack came on September 8, 1944, when a rocket slammed into Paris. Hours later, another struck London. In the months that followed, more than 3,000 V-2s were launched at cities including London, Antwerp, and Liège. An estimated 9,000 civilians and soldiers were killed and many more injured. The V-2's technological achievements astonished Allied scientists. It used gyroscopic guidance, sophisticated fuel pumps, and advanced aerodynamics. American and Soviet rocketry programs after the war would draw heavily on its design. Wernher von Braun, the brilliant and controversial engineer behind the V-2, would later become a key architect of NASA's Saturn V moon rocket. The human cost, yet the V-weapon's triumph was built on immense human suffering. Production took place in the Mittelwerk tunnels near Nordhausen, where the Nazis forced tens of thousands of prisoners from the nearby Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp to labor in brutal conditions. The underground factory was a place of horror. Prisoners worked 12 to 16 hours a day in darkness, starved and beaten, often sleeping among the dead. Disease was rampant, and executions were common for the smallest infractions. Historians estimate that at least 20,000 forced laborers died constructing the V-2, far more than were killed by the rockets themselves. This grim calculus that the weapon killed more in its making than in its use remains one of the most haunting facts of the entire Wunderwaffe saga. It underscores how the Nazi regime treated human life as expendable in pursuit of technological spectacle. Psychological warfare. Militarily, the V-weapons were too inaccurate to change the course of the war. They targeted cities rather than strategic installations, and their high cost diverted resources from more practical defenses. But as instruments of psychological warfare, they were devastating. In London and Antwerp, the sudden unstoppable strikes frayed nerves and forced costly countermeasures. Civilians endured months of nightly terror, never knowing when or where the next explosion would occur. Winston Churchill called the campaign the most cruel and deliberate attack on the civilian population of any country, a statement not of hyperbole, but of weary recognition. For Hitler, however, the V-1 and V-2 were powerful propaganda tools. He hailed them as vengeance weapons that would force the Allies to their knees. Joseph Goebbels, master of Nazi spin, trumpeted each launch as proof that Germany possessed the genius to strike back despite its shrinking territory and battered cities. Even as defeat loomed, the rockets allowed the regime to project an image of undiminished technological might. Legacy and aftermath. When Allied troops finally captured the launch sites in the Mittelwerk complex in 1945, they were stunned by the sophistication of the V-2 program. Both the United States and the Soviet Union rushed to secure rockets' blueprints and key personnel. In Operation Paperclip, the U.S. secretly brought Wernher von Braun and many of his team to America, where they laid the foundation for the U.S. Army's missile program, and ultimately, the Apollo missions. The Soviets too captured equipment and scientists jump-starting their own ballistic missile development. Thus, the V-2 conceived as a weapon of terror became the starting point of the Cold War space race. Humanity's path to the moon and beyond ironically ran through the tunnels of Mittelwerk and the suffering of thousands of slave laborers. The legacy of the V-weapons is therefore double-edged. They were technological marvels ahead of their time, yet morally tainted by their purpose and the cruelty of their construction. They proved that long-range rocketry was possible, but at a price paid in blood and fear. As 1944 bled into 1945, the Wunderwaffe program continued to churn out ambitious projects, some bordering on the fantastical, others on the cutting edge of engineering. Among these was a machine that embodied the Nazi belief in overwhelming force, the Tiger II or King Tiger, a tank so powerful it seemed to dare the Allies to challenge it head-on. From rockets that struck from the stratosphere, our journey now returns to the armored battlefields of Europe, where steel behemoths still sought to rule the ground even as Germany's fate slipped away. While rockets screamed across the skies, Nazi engineers were also perfecting a different kind of terror on the ground, the Tiger II, better known as the Königstiger or King Tiger. If the V weapon symbolized a leap into the future, this tank embodied a more traditional vision of battlefield supremacy, sheer armor, and overwhelming firepower. From Tiger I to the King. Germany's original Tiger I, introduced in 1942, had already earned a fearsome reputation. Allied crews quickly learned to dread its 88mm gun and thick frontal armor, which shrugged off most contemporary anti-tank rounds. But by 1943, Soviet T-34-85S and American M4A3E8 Shermans, fielded in growing numbers, began to challenge that dominance. Ever obsessed with staying ahead, Hitler demanded an even stronger machine, one that would be virtually invincible in a head-on fight. Two companies, Henschel and Porsche, submitted designs for the next generation of heavy tank. Henschel's model ultimately won the contract, though Porsche's prototype, the Tiger P, would influence later armored projects. The resulting Tiger II combined the best features of the Tiger I and the sloped armor design of the Panther, producing a tank that looked and fought like a rolling fortress. A fortress on tracks. The King Tiger weighed roughly 69 metric tons, nearly double that of a Sherman, and heavier even than many locomotives of the day. Its frontal armor reached a staggering 150 to 180 mm slope to increase effective thickness and deflect incoming rounds. Allied crews often joked grimly that shooting a King Tiger from the front was like throwing pebbles at a brick wall. The tank's main weapon was the 8.8 cm KWK-43 L71 gun, an evolution of the famed 88 used on the Tiger I and German anti-aircraft batteries. This longer-barreled version could pierce over 200 mm of armor at 1,000 meters, more than enough to destroy any Allied tank from well beyond the range at which they could reply effectively. At distances where Shermans or Cromwells would be struggling to aim, the King Tiger could kill with a single precise shot. Inside, a 5-man crew commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator worked in surprisingly cramped conditions given the vehicle's size. The gun required a well-trained team to load and fire quickly, and communication was critical when maneuvering the huge machine in battle. Battlefield performance. The King Tiger first appeared in combat in July 1944 during the fighting in Normandy just weeks after D-Day. Allied soldiers encountering it for the first time described a mix of awe and dread, a towering silhouette, the long barrel of the 88mm gun, and the near impossibility of penetrating its frontal armor. In engagements like the battles of Sandomierz in Poland and the Ardennes offensive in late 1944, small numbers of King Tigers inflicted heavy losses on Allied armored units. At long range and in open terrain, they could dominate the battlefield, picking off enemy tanks before those tanks could close to effective firing distance. But these victories came at a steep cost. The King Tiger's Maybach HL 230 P30 engine, while powerful at 700 horsepower, struggled to move its immense weight. Mechanical failures were frequent. Transmissions overheated, final drives broke, and the suspension strained under the load. Many King Tigers were abandoned or destroyed by their own crews simply because they broke down or ran out of fuel before reaching combat. Fuel consumption was especially crippling. At a time when Germany's oil reserves were already critically low, a single King Tiger could burn 500 liters of gasoline in 100 kilometers of travel, far more than lighter Allied tanks. Logistics units faced constant headaches moving the vehicles to the front, and their enormous weight limited them to certain roads and bridges. In muddy or snowy conditions, they could bog down and become easy targets for artillery or aircraft. The Allied response. Allied planners took the King Tiger seriously. Intelligence bulletins warned tank crews to avoid frontal engagements and to aim for the thinner side or rear armor whenever possible. Air power became the most reliable counter. Fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt or the Hawker Typhoon could disable a King Tiger with rockets or bombs, especially when the tank was caught on a road or immobilized by mechanical trouble. Soviet forces used massed artillery and the IS-2 heavy tank armed with a 122 mm gun to stand a fighting chance. Yet even then, multiple hits were often required to disable a King Tiger. German crews exploited this advantage by setting ambushes, positioning their tanks hull down behind cover, and knocking out multiple enemy vehicles before retreating. Numbers and impact. In total, about 489 King Tigers were produced between January 1944 and March 1945, tiny compared with the tens of thousands of Shermans or T-34s built by the Allies. Their limited numbers meant they could never change the overall course of the war. Nevertheless, their psychological impact was immense. Rumors of invincible super tanks spread quickly through Allied ranks. Soldiers who glimpsed the long-barreled 88 across a hedgerow often felt a chill of fear. Each destroyed Allied tank or stalled offensive seemed to validate the Nazi promise of Wunderwaffe even as Germany itself crumbled. Legacy. The Tiger II influenced post-war tank design, demonstrating the value of sloped armor and the importance of balancing firepower protection and mobility. Yet it also highlighted the limits of sheer size. Modern main battle tanks such as the American M1 Abrams or the German Leopard 2 owe more to the versatile, well-balanced designs of the war's later years than to the super-heavy concepts that obsessed Hitler. To walk around a surviving King Tiger today preserved in museums like Bovington in the UK or Saumur in France is to confront a paradox, a machine of remarkable engineering prowess, yet conceived in service of a doomed cause. Its thick plates and immense gun tell a story of human ingenuity, but also of desperation, a belief that bigger weapons could compensate for a collapsing strategy. From armor to air, even as these steel behemoths prowled Europe's battlefields, German innovators were pushing into an entirely new frontier of warfare, the skies themselves. Jet and rocket propulsion promised speeds once thought impossible, and engineers raced to harness them before the Allies could catch up. The next chapter of the Wunderwaffe saga would leave the clanking treads of heavy armor behind and leap into the thin air of high-speed flight. Their experimental aircraft, like the Messerschmitt Me-262 and the rocket-powered Me-163 Comet, would challenge not only Allied pilots, but the very limits of aeronautical science, setting the stage for the jet age that would define modern aviation. While the King Tiger thundered across battlefields at a slow, menacing crawl, Germany's aviation engineers were reaching for an entirely different kind of supremacy speed. By 1944, Allied bombers were pounding German cities daily, and the Luftwaffe struggled to defend the skies. Out of that desperate need came two extraordinary aircraft that pushed aviation into a new era: the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, and the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, the first and only rocket-powered interceptor ever to see combat. The jet age dawns. Messerschmitt Me-262. The Me-262 began life in 1938 as a design far ahead of its time. Engineers envisioned a fighter propelled not by propellers, but by the revolutionary new turbojet engine. Early prototypes faced countless obstacles: unreliable engines, shortages of critical metals for turbine blades, and skepticism from officials who doubted the practicality of jet power. By 1942, the concept was proven, but delays, some technical, others political, slowed deployment. Hitler himself demanded the plane be adapted as a fighter bomber rather than a pure interceptor, a decision that diverted precious months to redesign and testing. Still, when the Me-262 finally entered service in mid-1944, it was unlike anything Allied pilots had ever encountered. With a top speed of 870 kilometers per h, 540 miles per hour, The Me-262 could easily outrun the fastest Allied fighters, including the famed P-51 Mustang. Armed with 4 devastating 30mm Mk-108 cannons and in some variants R-4M air-to-air rockets, it could shred a heavy bomber formation in minutes. Veteran Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland called it the best aircraft of the war. Allied bomber crews were stunned by its velocity. Many first mistook it for a new kind of rocket because it closed distance so rapidly. Traditional dogfighting tactics were useless by the time a Mustang pilot spotted a Me-262. It was often already gone. Yet the jet's advantages came at a price. The Junkers Jumo 004 engines were temperamental, lasting barely 25 flight hours before requiring replacement. Sudden throttle changes could cause catastrophic flameouts. Takeoff and landing were the most vulnerable moments when the sluggish engines left pilots easy prey for Allied fighters patrolling near airfields. Skilled ground attacks destroyed many Me-262s before they ever reached combat altitude. Despite these challenges, Me-262 units claimed hundreds of Allied aircraft destroyed in late 1944 and early 1945. But the jet arrived too late, and in too few numbers. Fewer than 1/500 were built, and fuel shortages plus pilot training constraints meant far fewer ever flew combat missions. Its true legacy would unfold after the war, influencing every jet fighter that followed, from the Soviet MiG-15 to the American F-86 Sabre. A rocket on wings, Messerschmitt, Me-163 Comet. If the Me-262 heralded the jet age, the Me-163 Comet was something even more radical, a tailless, rocket-powered interceptor capable of blistering speeds. Designed by Alexander Lippisch, the Comet was intended to climb rapidly and smash Allied bomber formations before gliding back to Earth. Powered by a volatile Walter HWK-109, 509 rocket motor, the Me-163 could reach 960 kilometers per h, nearly 600 miles per hour, and soar to 12,000 meters in minutes, outpacing anything else in the sky. Its performance was so extreme that pilots experienced near spaceflight conditions, thin air freezing temperatures, and intense G-forces during climbs and dives. But the Comet was as dangerous to its own pilots as to the enemy. Its fuel, a hypergolic mixture of T-Stoff hydrogen peroxide and C-Stoff methanol hydrazine hydrate, ignited on contact, making even minor leaks deadly. Takeoffs and landings were harrowing. The aircraft used a jettisonable wheeled dolly for takeoff and a simple skid for landing. Many Comets exploded during these phases, claiming pilots before they ever faced Allied fighters. In combat, the Comet proved both awe-inspiring and frustrating. Its phenomenal speed allowed it to slash through bomber formations with near impunity, but it carried only a few minutes of powered flight. After 1 or 2 attack passes, the pilot had to glide back to base, vulnerable to Allied patrols. Accuracy was another problem. Closing speeds were so high that lining up a shot with its twin 30mm cannons was exceptionally difficult. Only about 300 Me-163s were built, and their operational impact was minimal. Nevertheless, the Comet's daring design offered invaluable data on high-speed aerodynamics and rocket propulsion insights that would later feed into both Cold War aircraft research and the nascent field of spaceflight. Technological legacy and the human cost. The combined story of the Me-262 and Me-163 illustrates the dual nature of the Wunderwaffe program, brilliant innovation entwined with tragic futility. These aircraft foreshadowed the jet-powered future of aviation, yet they arrived when Germany lacked the pilot's fuel and industrial stability to exploit them. Moreover, like the V-weapons, they were products of a brutal system. Forced laborers toiled under horrific conditions to manufacture critical engine components. Allied bombing campaigns targeted assembly plants, relentlessly further endangering those already living as captives. Still, the technical achievements cannot be denied. Captured Me-262s were flown and studied extensively by Allied engineers after the war. The British Gloster Meteor, the Soviet MiG series, and American jets such as the F-80 and F-86 all drew lessons from the German design. The Me-163's research on high-speed aerodynamics and rocket engines influenced both X-plane experiments and early spacecraft concepts. From sky to infantry small arms revolution. While these high-speed marvels dazzled the world, German weapons designers were also transforming warfare at the level of the individual soldier. On the ground, the introduction of the Sturmgewehr 44 STG-44 marked the birth of the modern assault rifle, a weapon whose influence would echo for decades. The STG-44 combined the rapid-fire capability of a submachine gun with the accuracy and range of a traditional rifle. Chambered for the intermediate 7.92x33 mm Kurz cartridge, it allowed soldiers to deliver controlled bursts at medium ranges perfect for the fast-moving mechanized battles of the mid-20th century. Many military historians consider it the direct ancestor of the famed AK-47, though mechanically, the two differ more than legend suggests. Even more ahead of its time was the Vampire infrared night vision system, which paired an infrared scope and active illuminator with the STG-44. Though bulky and deployed in limited numbers, it gave German troops a primitive but real ability to fight effectively in darkness, a capability that would not become standard for most armies until decades later. The Wunderwaffe program thus spanned every dimension of warfare, from Titanic tanks to supersonic jets, from terror rockets to infantry rifles that defined the battles of the future. But even as these innovations appeared, Germany's strategic situation grew hopeless. Factories lay in ruins, fuel supplies dwindled, and Allied armies closed in from east and west. As 1945 approached, Nazi engineers pushed into still more speculative territory: secret laboratories, chemical experiments, and the ultimate prize of the atomic age, a nuclear weapon. The next chapter of this story leads into those clandestine efforts where physics and ambition collided with sabotage and scarcity in the race for the bomb. While Germany's jet and rocket aircraft hinted at the future of the skies, the Sturmgewehr 44 STG-44 quietly transformed the battlefield, one infantryman at a time. This weapon, whose very name means storm rifle, represented a radical shift in small arms philosophy and earned a lasting reputation as the world's first true assault rifle. Birth of the assault rifle? Before the STG-44, soldiers typically carried either a full-power bolt-action rifle accurate at long range but slow to fire, or a pistol-caliber submachine gun designed for close quarters. World War II combat, however, revealed a gap between these extremes. Most firefights occurred at 100-300 meters ranges, where a heavy long-range cartridge was unnecessary and where automatic fire conferred a decisive edge. In 1942, responding to reports from the Eastern Front, German engineers developed an intermediate cartridge, the 7.92x33 mm Kurz. It provided manageable recoil and allowed a soldier to control short bursts of fire without sacrificing accuracy. Pairing this round with a gas-operated selective fire rifle yielded the MKB-42, which evolved through the MP-43 and MP-44 before Hitler, impressed by frontline reports, approved the new name Sturmgewehr 44 in late 1944. Design and performance. The STG-44 blended the best of rifles and submachine guns. Its 30-round detachable magazine fed a select fire action, allowing troops to fire semi-automatic for precision or full auto for close-range suppression. The intermediate cartridge kept recoil light, while an effective range of about 300-400 meters matched the realities of mid-century combat. Troops on the Eastern Front immediately recognized its advantages. Soviet soldiers captured examples and were startled by its versatility. German infantry squads armed with the STG-44 could unleash overwhelming firepower compared with units still relying on Karabiner 98K bolt-action rifles. Though production never reached the millions envisioned, about 425,000 were made, its battlefield impact was unmistakable. Influence and myth. The STG-44 is often called the direct forerunner of the AK-47, and while Mikhail Kalashnikov's design drew on many influences, the conceptual leap and intermediate cartridge in a lightweight automatic rifle clearly set the pattern for modern assault rifles. Today, nearly every military service rifle from the American M4 to the German HK416 owes something to the philosophy embodied in the STG-44. But the innovation didn't stop with the rifle itself. Fighting in the dark, the vampire scope. As Allied bombing blacked out Europe's nights, German engineers sought ways to fight after sunset. Their answer was the Zielgerät 1229 Vampire, an early infrared night vision system designed to mount on the STG-44. The setup included a bulky infrared scope and a backpack power supply with a spotlight that emitted invisible infrared light, allowing the rifleman to see in complete darkness through the scope's electronic image. Though cumbersome batteries and lamp together weighed more than the rifle itself, the system worked. German night fighting units, particularly on the Eastern Front, used it for ambushes and defensive operations. While only a few thousand units were deployed, the Vampire proved the concept decades before night vision became standard for modern armies. A future foreshadowed. The STG-44 and its infrared accessories demonstrated how the Wunderwaffe program wasn't only about colossal tanks or exotic aircraft, it also reshaped the experience of the individual soldier. Firepower, mobility, and visibility at night capabilities we now take for granted were being pioneered in the desperate final years of the Third Reich. Yet these advances could not overcome Germany's worsening crisis. By late 1944, Allied forces were overwhelming on every front. Fuel shortages paralyzed armor and aircraft production. Cities lay in ruins from relentless bombing, and morale eroded despite propaganda promises of miracle weapons. The elusive atom. Among the grandest promises was one that could have eclipsed every other project: the quest for a nuclear weapon. In theory, the Nazis possessed the scientific talent to pursue an atomic bomb. Brilliant physicists such as Werner Heisenberg and Otto Hahn understood nuclear fission. Early in the war, Germany launched a program known as the Uranverein, or Uranium Club, to explore the military potential of splitting the atom. Initial experiments in 1939 and 1940 showed promise, but the effort was fragmented and underfunded. Rivalries among research groups slowed progress, and the regime never gave the project the singular priority it received in the United States under the Manhattan Project. Some historians argue that German physicists misunderstood key calculations about critical mass. Others believe they intentionally downplayed their progress to avoid handing Hitler a weapon of unprecedented destructiveness. Heavy water and Allied sabotage. One critical obstacle was the production of heavy water, a form of water containing deuterium needed as a moderator in early reactor designs. Germany relied on the Norsk hydro plant at Vemork, Norway for this rare material. Recognizing the danger, the Allies launched a daring operation in 1943, Operation Gunnerside. Norwegian commandos parachuted into the frozen wilderness, crossed icy rivers, and infiltrated the heavily guarded plant. They planted explosives that crippled the facility without loss of civilian life, a mission so precise it remains legendary in the annals of special operations. Subsequent bombing raids and a dramatic sinking of a ferry carrying heavy water shipments further derailed German efforts. Combined with chronic shortages of uranium and the Allies' relentless bombing of industrial sites, these setbacks ensured the Nazi nuclear program never came close to building a bomb. By 1945, Heisenberg's team had only small experimental reactors far from producing weapons-grade material. What might have been? The what-ifs remain haunting. Had Germany poured Manhattan-level resources into the Uranverein in 1940 before war demands drained the economy, could they have built a bomb first? Most physicists doubt it. Scientific obstacles, limited access to fissile material, and internal rivalries made a wartime German bomb extraordinarily unlikely. Still, the mere possibility chilled Allied planners who dedicated significant intelligence resources to monitoring and sabotaging the effort. Technology amid ruin. By early 1945, even as Allied armies closed in, Hitler still clung to dreams of a miracle weapon that might snatch victory from certain defeat. V-rockets continued to fall on London and Antwerp. Mi-262 jets streaked through the skies. King Tigers and the occasional Mouse prototype rumbled at the front. Yet each wonder weapon was ultimately a tactical curiosity, a feat of engineering brilliance shackled to a collapsing strategy. The paradox of the Wunderwaffe was complete awe-inspiring advances built atop human misery, and destined to arrive too late in too few numbers or with fatal flaws. But their influence would not die with the Reich. Within months of Germany's surrender, Allied scientists were poring over captured documents, disassembling prototypes, and interviewing engineers. The knowledge gleaned from Nazi research would shape the Cold War arms race from assault rifles to space travel. As the war drew to its bloody close, the Allies moved swiftly to secure these technologies and the minds behind them. What began as a frantic search for secret weapons became the opening chapter of a new geopolitical rivalry. The next phase of our story follows that scramble when American, Soviet, and British forces raced not only to defeat Nazi Germany, but to capture its scientific future before their rivals could. While German engineers pushed boundaries with jets, rockets, and revolutionary small arms, one project towered above all others in its potential for devastation: the quest to unlock the atom. The Nazi leadership dreamed of wielding a weapon of almost supernatural power, but their nuclear ambitions, known collectively as the Uranverein or Uranium Club, never moved beyond laboratory experiments. Early spark of atomic ambition. In 1938, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann achieved a breakthrough by splitting the uranium atom, proving that nuclear fission could release tremendous energy. This discovery reverberated across the world's scientific community, prompting both excitement and fear. In theory, a bomb harnessing fission could unleash an explosion millions of times more powerful than conventional explosives. The German government, quick to recognize the military implications, organized a loose consortium of physicists, including Nobel laureate Werner Heisenberg, to explore the possibilities. At first, funding and attention were modest. Germany's early blitzkrieg victories seemed to promise quick conventional triumphs, reducing the perceived urgency of an atomic superweapon. Scientific hurdles and missteps. Despite possessing some of the era's most brilliant minds, the Uranverein faced significant scientific challenges. Early nuclear theory was still evolving, and crucial concepts such as critical mass and neutron moderation were not fully understood. Heisenberg's team focused on creating a nuclear reactor as a stepping stone to bomb development, but their calculations of the required uranium and heavy water were off by wide margins. Compounding the problem was Germany's lack of a centralized Manhattan Project-style effort. Rival research groups competed for scarce resources, often duplicating work rather than collaborating. The Nazi hierarchy, with its overlapping bureaucracies and ideological infighting, proved ill-suited to manage a project of such complexity. Heavy water, the lifeblood of the reactor. To slow neutrons and sustain a chain reaction, the Germans turned to heavy water, in which hydrogen atoms are replaced by deuterium as a moderator. Their best source was the Norsk Hydro plant in Vemork, Norway, which produced deuterium as a byproduct of fertilizer manufacturing. Recognizing its strategic importance, the Allies launched one of the most daring sabotage operations of the war. In February 1943, Norwegian commandos executed Operation Gunnerside, infiltrating the heavily guarded plant under the cover of night. They planted explosives that destroyed key equipment, crippling heavy water production without harming civilians. When the Germans attempted to ship remaining stocks across a Norwegian fjord months later, resistance fighters struck again, sinking the ferry Hydro and sending precious heavy water to the depths. These blows forced the Uranium Club to rely on tiny quantities of heavy water, slowing research to a crawl. The Allied bombing campaign. Beyond sabotage, the relentless Allied bombing of German infrastructure further hampered progress. Factories critical to refining uranium and building reactors were repeatedly targeted. Shortages of labor, fuel, and materials worsened as the war dragged on. By 1944, with cities in ruins and armies in retreat, the resources to sustain a large-scale nuclear project simply did not exist. Ethical questions and historical debate. Historians have long debated whether German scientists like Heisenberg deliberately avoided building a bomb or simply failed due to technical and logistical obstacles. Some point to a famous 1941 meeting between Heisenberg and his former mentor, Niels Bohr, in occupied Denmark, during which Heisenberg hinted at the moral dilemma of creating such a weapon. Others argue he overestimated the amount of uranium required, inadvertently stalling progress. Regardless of intent, the outcome was clear. Germany never came close to producing a functional atomic weapon. Their most advanced reactor in Haigerloch, a modest lattice of uranium cubes suspended in heavy water, was far from achieving criticality when captured by Allied forces in April 1945. Operation Alsos racing for the atom. The Allies were determined to know exactly how close Germany had come. Under the codename Operation Alsos, special teams of scientists and military personnel followed advancing armies into Europe, seizing documents, materials, and key personnel before they could be hidden or captured by the Soviets. In March 1945, Alsos units discovered the Haigerloch reactor and arrested several leading physicists, including Heisenberg. Their findings confirmed that the Nazi nuclear program had lagged far behind the American Manhattan Project. Yet the intelligence they gathered proved invaluable, both for its reassurance and for the scientific insights it provided. What might have been, the hypothetical of a Nazi atomic bomb has fueled decades of speculation. Could the war's outcome have changed if Germany had begun a crash program in 1939 with Manhattan-level resources? Most scholars doubt it. Even with perfect calculations and no sabotage, the scarcity of uranium ore, the difficulty of isotope separation, and the fractured Nazi research establishment made a wartime bomb extraordinarily unlikely. Nevertheless, the fear of such a weapon profoundly shaped Allied strategy. The decision to accelerate America's own atomic program was motivated in part by the possibility, however remote, that Germany might get there first. In that sense, the mere rumor of a Nazi bomb influenced world history. Transition from atom to aftermath. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Wunderwaffe narrative had collapsed alongside the Third Reich. V-2 rockets and Me-262 jets lay scattered across bombed-out airfields. The Maus prototype sat idle in a ravaged testing ground. And deep in mountain tunnels, Allied troops found piles of documents and half-finished experiments, remnants of a desperate gamble that had consumed enormous resources while failing to alter the war's outcome. Yet even in defeat, the Reich's technological legacy would not be lost. American, British, and Soviet teams raced to capture not only hardware, but the scientists themselves. Many of these men, some complicit in the regime's crimes, would go on to shape the next era of global competition. Operation Paperclip and the Cold War seeds. Perhaps the most famous effort was Operation Paperclip, a U.S. program to secretly relocate German scientists and engineers to America. Werner von Braun and his V-2 team, responsible for the rockets that had terrorized London, became pivotal figures in the U.S. space program. Their expertise fed directly into the development of ballistic missiles and ultimately the Saturn V rocket that carried astronauts to the moon. The Soviet Union launched similar efforts, seizing equipment and personnel to jumpstart its own missile and nuclear projects. In this way, the technological fruits of the Wunderwaffe program were transplanted into the soil of the Cold War, where they would grow into the arsenals and space fleets of two superpowers. The final days of wonder. By war's end, many of Germany's so-called miracle weapons existed only as prototypes or paper dreams, yet their influence proved enduring. The V-2 became the template for space exploration. Jet engines revolutionized aviation. The STG-44's design philosophy reshaped infantry combat. Even failed ventures like the Ratte and nuclear program offered lessons, cautionary tales of ambition, unmoored from practicality. In the rubble of 1945, Allied soldiers found more than wreckage. They found a roadmap to the technological future. The price, however, was immeasurable: millions dead, cities annihilated, and countless victims forced into slave labor to feed the Nazi appetite for technological glory. As the Allies sifted through captured factories and secret bunkers, one question lingered: what would become of the scientists whose brilliance had served such a brutal regime? The answer would define the next chapter, a story of capture recruitment and a new global rivalry where yesterday's enemies became today's prized assets. By the spring of 1945, the so-called wonder weapons that had promised to reverse Germany's fortunes lay scattered across a disintegrating Reich. Allied armies pressed from every direction. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, and Nazi leaders clung to fantasies of last-minute salvation, even as Berlin crumbled around them. What followed was a frantic scramble, not just for victory, but for the technological secrets that might shape the world after the guns fell silent. The end of the Wunderwaffe dream. In the final months of the war, Wunderwaffe projects were still underway in hidden laboratories, mountain tunnels, and forest clearings. Engineers continued to assemble V-2 rockets in the vast underground complex of Mittelwerk, while Me-262 jets launched desperate sorties from bomb-scarred airfields. But these efforts were like sparks in a hurricane. Allied bombing campaigns destroyed supply lines, fuel reserves, and factories. Without oil, even the most advanced tanks and aircraft were useless. Hitler, increasingly delusional, clung to the belief that a single decisive weapon might yet appear. He issued orders to deploy miracle tanks and rockets in final strikes that could never be carried out. In reality, the Wunderwaffe had become a tragic spectacle, brilliant machines conceived by brilliant minds arriving too late and in too few numbers to matter. A race for secrets. As Allied forces surged across Europe, they understood that victory meant more than toppling the Third Reich. Whoever captured Germany's scientific treasures would gain a head start in the dawning age of rockets, jets, and nuclear power. The result was an intense, often secretive contest among the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union to seize prototypes, documents, and most importantly, the scientists themselves. American units of Operation Alsos fanned out across Germany, interrogating researchers and confiscating equipment. They followed leads from one collapsing city to the next, racing Soviet troops toward critical sites. In the Harz Mountains, they discovered the Mittelwerk tunnels, a nightmarish warren where tens of thousands of slave laborers had assembled V-2 rockets under brutal conditions. Starved prisoners emerged, blinking into daylight as Allied soldiers documented the immense underground factory. Elsewhere, Allied teams captured Me-262 jet fighters, V-1 launch ramps, and experimental radar and guidance systems. They filled rail cars with crates of blueprints, engine parts, and half-finished prototypes. Much of this material would later seed the technological leaps of the Cold War. Human shadows behind the machines. Every discovery carried a grim reminder of the human suffering that had powered these marvels. At Mittelwerk alone, at least 20,000 forced laborers, many drawn from the nearby Dora Mittelbau concentration camp, had died from starvation, disease, and abuse. Survivors described 12-hour shifts in darkness, living among corpses, beaten for the slightest mistake. The rockets that terrorized London had killed more people in their making than in their use. Similar stories emerged elsewhere. Prisoners dragged through icy tunnels to assemble jet engines, civilians deported to work on chemical fuels, and scientists complicit in experimentation on concentration camp inmates. The Wunderwaffe was not merely a triumph of engineering, it was also a monument to cruelty. Operation Paperclip and Soviet hunts. Even as the atrocities came to light, geopolitical realities pushed the Allies to secure German expertise before the Soviets could. Under the clandestine Operation Paperclip, the United States recruited more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians, many with Nazi Party ties. Among them was Wernher von Braun, architect of the V-2 rocket, whose work would later propel America's Saturn V and the Apollo missions to the moon. The Soviet Union waged its own campaign, seizing factories and abducting specialists from the eastern zones it occupied. Entire families of engineers were relocated to secret facilities in the USSR, where their knowledge jump-started Soviet missile and jet programs. The Cold War's missile race, including the race to space, was born from this scramble for Nazi science. Captured prototypes and hidden labs, Allied troops found a trove of strange machines that testified to the breadth of German experimentation. In addition to V-weapons and jets, they uncovered advanced submarines like the type Colossal U-boat, capable of staying submerged for far longer than any Allied counterpart, and radar systems that hinted at electronic warfare decades ahead of their time. In mountain bunkers, soldiers discovered partial blueprints for weapons that seemed almost fantastical: high-speed ramjets, vertical takeoff aircraft, and experimental guided missiles. Many were incomplete or impractical, but they revealed a restless ambition to leap beyond conventional warfare. Some caches contained deliberate destruction, burned papers, smashed prototypes, as German scientists attempted to hide evidence of atrocities or deny secrets to the enemy. Yet enough survived to astonish Allied investigators and to accelerate post-war technological development on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Moral reckonings. The capture of these technologies forced difficult questions. Should nations that had fought a war against tyranny now reward those who had served it simply because their knowledge was valuable? In the United States, Operation Paperclip proceeded largely in secret to avoid public outrage. Many of the recruited scientists had been members of the Nazi Party. Some were implicated in the use of slave labor and human experimentation. Soviet authorities faced similar moral compromises, overlooking past crimes in the race to compete with the West. The irony was stark weapons created to uphold a murderous regime became stepping stones for the superpowers that had defeated it. Legacy of the Wunderwaffe. By war's end, the myth of Nazi wonder weapons had both collapsed and triumphed. Collapsed because none had delivered the miraculous victory Hitler promised. Triumphed because their technological DNA lived on in American rockets, Soviet jets, European assault rifles, and the very idea that science could rewrite the battlefield. The age of spaceflight, intercontinental missiles, and night vision warfare can trace part of its lineage to the frantic laboratories of the Third Reich. But these machines also serve as warnings. They remind us that brilliance without conscience leads to ruin, that innovation can be harnessed to evil as easily as to progress. The Wunderwaffe were not just weapons. They were symbols of a society that believed technology could substitute for morality. That spectacle could mask catastrophe. Toward the final act, as Allied soldiers sifted through shattered cities and secret tunnels, the Third Reich disintegrated. Hitler died in his bunker on April 30th, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally a week later. The engineers and scientists who had once promised miracles now faced interrogation rooms instead of triumphal parades. Yet their creations would echo through the decades to come. The rockets that once rained destruction on London would someday lift satellites into orbit. The jet engines that powered desperate Luftwaffe interceptors would become standard in every commercial airliner. The assault rifle concept pioneered in the STG-44 would reshape infantry combat worldwide. In that sense, the Wunderwaffe achieved a dark kind of immortality. They could not save the regime that birthed them, but they forever changed the trajectory of modern technology and warfare. From the smoky ruins of Berlin to the hidden vaults of Alpine laboratories, the Allies carried away more than victory. They carried away the raw materials of the future. And as the Cold War dawned, these captured secrets would ignite new rivalries, proving that the legacy of Nazi wonder weapons was far from over. As the guns of World War II fell silent, a new contest began, one waged not with tanks or rockets in combat, but with clipboards, cargo planes, and secret intelligence orders. The Allies understood that the technology behind Germany's wonder weapons could shape the balance of power for decades. Whoever secured the mines that created the V2, the Me-262, the STG-44, and countless experimental projects would gain an incalculable advantage in the next era of global rivalry. Operation Paperclip, America's Quiet Harvest. The United States moved first and fastest. Under the clandestine program later known as Operation Paperclip, American military intelligence drew up lists of German scientists, engineers, and technicians who could advance U.S. research in rocketry, aviation, chemistry, and medicine. Teams from the Army's ALSOS mission and the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency crisscrossed the ruins of Germany, identifying candidates and spiriting them, and often their families, out of the collapsing Reich. Among the most famous recruits was Werner von Braun, the charismatic engineer who had overseen the V2 rocket program at Peenemünde, and more darkly at the Mittelwerk tunnels, where thousands of slave laborers perished. Along with over 100 members of his team, von Braun arrived in America in 1945. Within a few years, these same men who once built weapons for Hitler were testing rockets for the U.S. Army in the New Mexico desert. Their work would evolve into the Redstone missile, and eventually the mighty Saturn V that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon. The United States did not confine its recruitment to rocketry. Jet engine specialists, chemical engineers, and experts in guided missiles were all quietly absorbed into American laboratories and military bases. Many of their Nazi Party affiliations, and in some cases involvement in forced labor programs, were deliberately obscured or expunged from official records to ease their immigration and employment. For Washington, the calculus was simple in a world where the Soviet Union loomed as the next rival. Technological superiority outweighed moral clarity. The Soviet Trophy Brigades. The Soviet Union mounted an equally determined, if less publicized, campaign. Red Army Trophy Brigades swept through eastern Germany, dismantling entire factories and transporting equipment blueprints and personnel to the USSR. In the occupied zone, Soviet officers rounded up German scientists, sometimes voluntarily, often not, and relocated them with their families to secret research cities. One striking example was Operation Osoaviakim in 1946, when Soviet forces moved more than 2,000 German specialists and their dependents to the Soviet Union overnight. Engineers who had worked on the V2 program found themselves in isolated compounds on the Baltic or deep inside Russia, helping lay the groundwork for what would become the R-1 missile and eventually the famous R-7 that launched Sputnik. Soviet jet and aeronautical research also benefited enormously. Captured Messerschmitt. Mi-262S and Heinkel jet designs informed the early MiG fighters that would soon challenge Western pilots over Korea and beyond. Though life in the USSR was often harsh for these transplanted Germans, many eventually returned home after years of forced collaboration, their knowledge firmly integrated into Soviet industry. Britain and the other allies. The United Kingdom, though financially strained after 6 years of war, also sought its share of Germany's technological spoils. British teams captured V2 hardware and scientists testing the rockets on the island of Wight and at facilities in Scotland. Jet engine advances gleaned from German laboratories accelerated Britain's own aircraft development, helping the Royal Air Force move swiftly into the jet age with planes like the Gloucester Meteor. France too absorbed German expertise, particularly in rocketry and aeronautics. Smaller Allied nations collected what they could, though the lion's share of high-value personnel went to the two emerging superpowers. Moral compromises and controversies. These recruitment efforts forced the victorious Allies to confront uncomfortable moral questions. Many of the scientists had been members of the Nazi Party. Some were implicated in war crimes or had overseen forced labor projects where thousands died. Von Braun himself knew of the horrific conditions at Mittelwerk. Yet in the atmosphere of the early Cold War, such associations were downplayed or ignored. Background checks were manipulated, records sanitized, and public scrutiny avoided. In the United States, journalists and a few members of Congress occasionally raised alarms about employing former Nazis. But government officials argued that failing to secure German expertise would give the Soviets a dangerous edge. The debate foreshadowed a recurring theme of the Cold War, the willingness of nations to set aside ethical concerns in pursuit of technological supremacy. Seeds of the space race and the arms race. The impact of these captured minds was immediate and profound. In America, the V2 served as the template for early ballistic missiles like the Redstone and Jupiter. Data from German high-speed wind tunnel tests guided the design of supersonic aircraft and eventually intercontinental ballistic missiles (ICBMs). Von Braun's team became the backbone of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, culminating in the Apollo program's moon landings in 1969. In the Soviet Union, the work of transplanted German engineers accelerated the development of the R-7 Semyorka, the rocket that launched Sputnik 1 in 1957 and later carried Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. German expertise thus helped ignite both the space race and the era of global nuclear deterrence. The legacy extended to smaller weapons as well. The STG-44's design philosophy influenced the ubiquitous AK-47. Jet engine research inspired new generations of fighters on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Even concepts that never reached production ramjets, advanced submarines, guided missiles provided stepping stones for post-war experimentation. Echoes of the Wunderwaffe. Ironically, the same weapons that failed to save Nazi Germany ensured its technological immortality. The V-2, once a terror weapon, became the ancestor of peaceful space exploration. Jet fighters conceived in desperation pointed the way toward commercial air travel. Night vision scopes and assault rifles transformed infantry tactics worldwide. Yet this inheritance carried a dark shadow. Every rocket launch and supersonic flight owed something to the suffering of concentration camp prisoners and forced laborers who died assembling these miracle weapons. The scientific brilliance could not be separated from the brutality that produced it. A new world order? By the early 1950s, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union defined global politics. The German scientists scattered across both blocs became pivotal figures in this emerging Cold War, shaping not only military arsenals, but also humanity's first ventures into outer space. Their wartime work, once cloaked in secrecy and propaganda, had become the foundation of a new geopolitical reality. The Allies' scramble for Nazi technology thus blurred the moral line between victor and vanquished. Yesterday's enemies became today's prized experts. The wonder weapons designed for conquest instead fueled an arms race that spanned continents and decades. As the Cold War intensified, the myth of the Wunderwaffe evolved once again. No longer a promise of Nazi salvation, it became a cautionary tale of how desperation can accelerate innovation, how science can serve both horror and progress, and how the spoils of war can shape the destiny of the entire planet. From the ashes of the Third Reich, a new age of rockets, jets, and nuclear standoffs was born, proof that the legacy of Hitler's so-called miracle weapons did not end with Germany's surrender. It merely changed flags and pointed humanity toward a future as thrilling as it was perilous. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent, the Nazis' so-called Wunderwaffe, their wonder weapons, stood revealed as a paradox, dazzling feats of engineering that failed to deliver the salvation Hitler promised, yet changed the technological trajectory of the modern world. Their story is more than a catalog of machines. It is a cautionary saga about ambition, myth-making, and the double-edged nature of scientific progress. Myths that outlived the Reich. During the war, Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda ministry trumpeted every rumor of miracle weapons as proof of Germany's inevitable triumph. Newspapers teased secret projects poised to shatter Allied resolve. Hitler himself spoke of decisive breakthroughs, feeding the idea that some hidden superweapon would turn the tide. When Germany surrendered and none of these weapons had won the war, one might have expected the myth to die. Instead, it only deepened, nourished by captured prototypes, dramatic Allied intelligence reports, and the dawning Cold War. Popular magazines in the late 1940s ran breathless stories of Nazi flying saucers and orbital death rays. Pulp novels and comic books transformed half-truths into legend, turning abandoned sketches into tales of near victory. The enduring fascination with Die Glock, the bell, the sun gun, and the gigantic Landkreuzer Ratte shows how the human imagination clings to possibilities even when evidence is thin. These myths thrive because they dramatize a question we can't stop asking. What if Germany had unleashed an unstoppable jet fleet earlier? What if a nuclear weapon had been within reach? Each speculation invites both fear and wonder. Real achievements, dark foundations. Behind the legends were genuine breakthroughs that reshaped the post-war world. Rocketry. The V-2 was the first true ballistic missile, a direct ancestor of modern space launch vehicles and ICBMs. Jet aviation. The Me-262 proved the viability of jet-powered fighters, setting the stage for the jet age in both military and commercial flight. Infantry weapons. The STG-44 introduced the concept of the assault rifle and even rudimentary night vision technology, foreshadowing the standard equipment of modern soldiers. Yet every one of these achievements was built on suffering. Thousands of prisoners died in the underground middlework tunnels assembling V-2 rockets. Forced labor produced components for jets and heavy tanks. Scientists who later became celebrated pioneers often worked side by side with an oppressive regime, accepting if not directing its cruelty. The technological brilliance of the Wunderwaffe cannot be separated from the moral abyss of the system that produced it. From ruins to the space age. The immediate post-war scramble to capture Nazi technology and talent ensured that these innovations did not vanish with the Reich. Operation Paperclip brought Wernher von Braun and his rocket team to the United States, where their expertise fueled the development of the Redstone missile, and eventually the Saturn V rocket that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon. In the Soviet Union, German engineers and blueprints accelerated the R-7 missile program, which launched both Sputnik and the first human Yuri Gagarin into space. Jet designs such as the Me-262 informed the early MiG fighters and the first generation of NATO jets. Even the conceptual leap of the STG-44 echoed in the AK-47 and the M16 weapons that defined infantry combat for decades. Thus, the Wunderwaffe became a strange legacy. Weapons conceived for domination became the seeds of space exploration and global communication, while also fueling the nuclear arms race and the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. Lessons in ambition and hubris. The history of these miracle weapons is also a study in the limits of technological salvation. Many projects, the colossal Ratty tank, the Sun Gun, the Bell, remained impractical fantasies that devoured resources without altering the war's outcome. Others, like the Me-262, were brilliant but deployed too late and in too small numbers to matter strategically. Germany's leaders believed that scientific genius could compensate for strategic overreach and dwindling resources. They confused innovation with solution, imagining that one spectacular breakthrough could reverse a conflict already lost. In doing so, they revealed a recurring human temptation, the hope that technology alone can rescue us from the consequences of flawed decisions. A mirror for the modern world. The allure of the Wunderwaffe endures because it speaks to modern anxieties. Even today, nations chase game-changing technologies, hypersonic missiles, cyber weapons, artificial intelligence, with the belief that a single leap could redefine global power. The Nazi experience warns how easily such pursuits can become detached from reality or ethics. It reminds us that innovation without accountability can lead to atrocities, that brilliant minds can serve monstrous ends, and that myths of technological salvation can outlast the regimes that create them. The Final Reckoning. Walk through the museums where these machines now rest. Me-262 jets in polished hangars. V-2 rockets standing silent. The lone mouse tank hulking in a corner of Kubinka, and a complicated picture emerges. They are marvels of engineering and monuments to suffering, trophies of war, and warnings to the future. The Wunderwaffe did not win the Second World War. They did, however, shape the one that followed. They propelled humanity into space, hastened the nuclear age, and embedded the lesson that science is never neutral. Technology carries the values of those who wield it, whether for conquest, exploration, or survival. In the end, the miracle weapons were neither miracles nor mere myths. They were the last desperate gamble of a doomed regime and the first chapter of a new technological epic. Their story endures as a reminder that the true power of invention lies not only in what it can build, but in what it can destroy, and that the future is always forged in the choices we make about both.